In this video, I'm looking at the game between Andrey Esipenko and Hikaru Nakamura from round 2 of the candidates. Before we dive in, let's look at the standings after the first round. So there were 3 winners. We have Javakhir Sindarov, Fabiano Caruana and Rameshbabu Pragnananda, who all won with white. And then we had 1 draw. We had Blue Baum against Wei Yi, and, well, we are looking at 2 of the losers in this game. So let's turn our attention to Esipenko and Nakamura. Esipenko must fear, as one of the weaker players in the tournament, that he will turn into the whipping boy of the tournament. Nakamura's pride will have been dented after his loss against Caruana, but more than that, he knows he played poorly against Fabiano, and he'll want to discover whether he's still capable of playing at a top level. I mean, he certainly is, of course, but it might take him time to get into his stride. So it's a tricky one for both players. Just before I get going with the game, I also want to mention that Svetlana Demchenko is once again recording some round reports covering the women's candidates, and I'm delighted that to welcome her back to the PowerPlayChess channel. So do check out her report. She won't be able to cover every round, but about half of them. And remember, if you subscribe to the PowerPlayChess channel and click for notifications, you'll know immediately when our round reports have been posted. Okay, let's take a look at this game between Esipenko and Nakamura. Esipenko, 24 years old, against Nakamura, 38 years old. And it's an English, and very similar to Nakamura's game yesterday against Caruana. Now, if you remember, Nakamura played d4, which obviously leaves a lot of imbalance in the position. Today he was more circumspect, just developed. And again, he could still play d4, but he went for c5. So we could transpose into a kind of Catalan with d4. Esipenko took instead. Now, if pawn takes, then that's Tarrasch. I mean, that has a nice reputation for white. But knight takes d5 from Nakamura. And then d4. An exchange on d4 and castles. You can see that bishop rakes across the board. It's almost a symmetrical pawn structure. But the difference is these 2 bishops. The bishop on g2 is more active than the bishop on e7. And that gives white a pleasant advantage. But black is very, very solid here. I noticed from my database there's a game between Alexander Alekhine and Sir Stuart Milner Barry from Margate 1938. So Alexander Alekhine, world champion, and yes, he regained the title in 37, of course. So he was world champion again in 1938. And Stuart Milner Barry, I knew personally. He was a wonderful man. Played for the England team in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. And just an absolute gentleman. Alekhine played e4 here, which is okay. But Esipenko kept his options open. He might advance with e4, he might not. But queen b3 puts pressure here, puts pressure on b7. And now Nakamura has a few difficulties in developing the queen side. It's in some ways very much like a Catalan, where this bishop is superb on the long diagonal, and there's a problem with developing the bishop on c8. So Nakamura plays knight c6. Now this is a compromise, because it allows the pawns to be split, and if white can pile up on that c-pawn, that might be very pleasant. But the advantage from black's viewpoint is that now the bishop can emerge on a6, and you might be able to use the b file as well, gaining time against the queen. So, a reasonable compromise. Esipenko advanced. The knight went back to f6. And now h3. Now normally I don't like these little pawn moves at the side of the board, but this makes sense because after bishop e3 you don't want to be hassled by knight g4, and this is a very, very secure fortress with the bishop. Very secure for white's king, which now has a nice bolt hole. Bishop a6, there we go, nice active square. Rook d1 hits the queen, and queen b6. So you can see that Nakamura has a little bit of activity which compensates for the slight structural defect here, an isolated pawn, potentially weak. Now, white does not want to exchange, which would just improve black's structure, open up the a-file. But bishop b3 instead. It's interesting, he doesn't mind having the pawns doubled because that will open up the a-file for the rook, and obviously that's quite pleasant. So bishop c5, an exchange, and queen c3. So this exchange would be very pleasant for white because there are no real complications, and sooner or later you're going to be able to pile up on that pawn, you know, maybe putting a knight on c5. So after queen c3, the queen went back to b6, knight d2, c5, well that claims the d4 square. Of course, if the pawn advances to e5, then knight comes to that beautiful d5 square, so it's not worth doing that yet, at any rate. b3, so just taking c4 under control, and knight c4. Now this knight could hop to any of these squares, quite dangerous, so Nakamura exchanges off his bishop and plays e5. So that means with this pawn blocked, then the bishop isn't too good at the moment on g2. That knight covers the d5 square, so it kind of complements the pawn, which covers the dark square. But there is still potentially a problem with the pawn on c5. Rook c1. It hits the pawn. I mean, Nakamura could have sort of complicated a little bit here with rook d4. Because after this, yes, white controls the file, but you never know. With this protected passed pawn, that could offer counterplay. But I sort of understand why he didn't want to do that, because, you know, white does control the file there. But instead he took and played a5. So later on it might be nice to play a4, a little minority attack breaking up those pawns. Rook c1 and rook c8. It also means having played a5, then white can't play b4 to exploit the pin. But obviously Esipenko is better here. There's a bit of pressure. He's sort of tied black's pieces to the defence, and now he starts to sort of probe away. Queen c3, looking at the pawn. Queen c7, Nakamura defending everything at the moment. Then h4. There we go, the h-pawn yet again. If you remember, Caruana managed to gain space on the king's side and cramped Nakamura's king yesterday, so it's a similar kind of thing. And you know, in light of that game from yesterday, when Nakamura allowed that pawn to h5, I was surprised that Nakamura didn't just play g6 here and then king g7. Seems to me that that's the kind of sound way to play. You could even play h5 here. I think g6 is better, because sometimes you might want to play knight h5. I'll show you how and when later. But Nakamura played h6. Really surprised me. I mean, it's not a big deal. Anyway, rook c2. Now he played g6. I really don't see the difference. I don't see why you can't play g6 straight away. But anyway. Queen e3. There was, around about this point, Esipenko had 17 minutes left. Nakamura had about 8 minutes, and there was some head shaking from Nakamura. You know, didn't seem too comfortable in this position because the queen looks at h6. There's pressure here. It's, yeah, not such a nice position. We're only on move 27, so Nakamura had just 8 minutes to get to the time control. 13 moves in 8 minutes, so a bit of time pressure for Naka here. Now it's interesting, instead of just defending, Nakamura chose an active defense. He played queen d8. He invested some time there. And I think, you know, if he's not careful, he could slip into a passive position. So if queen takes pawn, then obviously that one wins a rook. So rook d2 hits the queen. And now, instead of defending passively with queen f8, queen b6. So this is interesting. So this is what Nakamura was thinking about before he played queen d8. So if queen takes pawn, then he's going to activate his rook. And there is certainly counterplay here. e4 is vulnerable, but also there's going to be counterplay on that first rank. So queen b6. So Esipenko preferred to control the position. And this bishop could come to c4. Again, echoes of yesterday's game against Caruana, where Caruana had the bishop on d5, pressing on the pawn on f7. So yeah, if Esipenko can get control here, you know, imagine a bishop on c4, you claim control of the d file, you protect the pawn, and you invade on d6. This could be nasty because, you know, there are targets in the position. Nakamura played king g7. Well, it guards that one. a4, so stops this idea of playing a4 to break up the pawns. Rook c6. And if bishop c4 here, then rook d6, and that's okay for black. It would be very nice. It would be very okay if you could actually land the rook on d4. But rook c2, so tying black to defense here. And this is interesting. So we're on move 31, and Nakamura had about 3.5 minutes left. So 9 moves in 3.5 minutes. So that's pressure. But at this moment, Naka kind of went into hustle mode. Now you can wait here, but well, Nakamura discovered yesterday that waiting isn't always advisable. You know, you could play h5, for example. But he went active. And now the pressure was on Esipenko. So Esipenko had 7 minutes remaining. Okay, it's more than Nakamura, but still, you know, you can't hang around. So this is a pawn sack. Okay, you've got to exchange queens. And now this pawn can be captured in 3 different ways. Which is best? What would you play here? I think we need a think and drink moment. White play. How would you recapture that pawn? Or not even recapture. How would you capture the pawn? Cheers. Do you want to improve your chess? Get access to live masterclasses with yours truly? Then subscribe to patreon.com/PowerPlayChess, and for just $25 a month, you get a newsletter with a test game, calculation puzzles, a monthly opening survey, access to an archive with over 100 opening surveys. And you can join in live masterclasses exclusive to patrons where you can ask me questions directly over Zoom. All for only $25 per month. Do subscribe to patreon.com/PowerPlayChess and join the club. Do consider becoming a patron. They're worth it just for those monthly live masterclasses, which are great fun, I'm telling you. So, here we go. Well, this is a bit of a trick question because all 3 captures are possible. And it's basically a very clever little pawn sacrifice from Nakamura to simplify the position. So, if rook takes pawn, Then rook takes pawn on b3. And this is already fine. I mean, white can pretend to be better here, but not really. It's possible to play rook b4. And, well, we could simplify straight away like that. That's possible. You can also take on e4 here. So rook c4, yeah, that simplifies a bit too quickly. Okay, what about pawn takes? It'd be nice to get that passed pawn going. But knight takes. Now be careful. If that knight blockades on c5, then black has a serious advantage. So c5, rook c6. Okay, we're going to take the pawn. Bishop g2, pins, and f5. Now, white can go into a rook and pawn endgame and bring the king over, but basically black's king is coming over very quickly, and black has no difficulties at all. So I think Esipenko played it in the best way, which is to take on c4. So if you got that one, well done. So knight takes, and you still got to get it right with black actually. This causes the most problems for black. So rook e2. Now if the knight goes back, in fact bishop d5 is a good move. So you don't take on e5. If f6, then rook c2, and this is very dangerous. This is, one of those typical rook and bishop against rook and knight endgames where the bishop is superior to the knight, basically. So f5 is necessary. Got to drive that away. Now, in this case, if you go for the rook and bishop against rook and knight endgame, after bishop d5, then e4 creates a passed pawn, and that gives black sufficient counterplay. Of course, if that's taken, then this pawn can be taken here, and well, obviously that's just equal. Let's go back. So basically, this should be taken. This is the game continuation, and now we exchange down into a rook and pawn endgame, a kind of classic rook and pawn endgame with 3v3 on the king side and this passed a pawn. The problem for white is that the rook is in the wrong position. You really need the rook behind the pawn to push it. Once this rook, black's rook is too active. Once the rook gets behind the pawn, then black has no difficulties. And the problem is the king doesn't have cover either. I mean, if you want to try and win this, you've got to dash the king over, but then you can to the queen side. But these pawns are too vulnerable. So let's see how things went. So rook a7 hits a pawn. Another check here. Of course, the king could just come back and it'll be a draw. But well, yes, Esipenko, fair play to him. He still does test Nakamura a little bit. So this is the problem, that when the king comes over, the rook raids and takes a pawn, and then black has counterplay with his own pawns. And this just isn't enough. So instead of heading towards the a pawn, Esipenko goes for the king side, but it's not good enough. There we go. That's the key move. You just have to put the rook behind the pawn before white is able to play rook b7 and a7, which would win. So you play rook a3 and then king e6. Okay, this is how the game went. And at this point, Esipenko just offered a draw. Let's just see how things might have gone. g5 is a clean move. It's going to lead to all the pieces being exchanged and so on. Or one last try, h5, but then this one advances, and well, if you're not careful, you could even lose this. So yeah, better for white just to exchange off everything, and that's going to be a draw. So I thought in this game both players were somewhat risk averse. Nakamura chose an opening which was solid, but didn't offer great counter chances for black. Esipenko was slightly better, but he didn't risk too much in going for a win. I think both players had basically, both players had basically decided that losing a second game was just not a sensible option, but a draw was acceptable. So there we go. Let's take a look at the scores. Well, after the drama of the first round, as you can see, all 4 games were drawn today. There wasn't too much going on. I mean, Prague pressed a little bit, but yeah, no one really was in any great trouble. So there we go. Let's take a look at the scores again. So we have Pragyananda, Sindarov and Caruana still ahead of the field with just 12 games to play.